Eleanor Whitmore did not scream when Jonathan Hale announced his engagement to another woman in front of every soul in Richmond. She stood perfectly still, her chin level, her hands folded, and she smiled. Not because she was unbroken, but because she refused to let them see what breaking looked like. That smile cost her everything she had left. If this story moves something inside you, subscribe to this channel. Follow Eleanor to the very end and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. The summer of 1814 came to Richmond, Virginia, the way it always did. Heavy and slow, the heat pressing down on everything like a hand that refused to lift. The air smelled of honeysuckle and horse dust, and the faint sweetness of candle wax burning in every window of the Richmond Society House, which stood at the top of Church Hill like a declaration of everything that mattered in this world. Wealth, name, position, and the ruthless, invisible machinery of who belonged and who did not. Eleanor Whitmore was 20 years old that night. She wore her mother's ivory gown, altered 3 times over, because the Whitmore family could no longer afford a seamstress on standing contract. The lace at the collar was real. It had been real for 30 years, passed down from a grandmother who had known better days, and Eleanor had pressed it herself that morning with a flat iron heated twice over the kitchen fire. She had taken care with every detail because she understood in the quiet and practical way she understood most things that appearances were a form of armor. And tonight, she needed every piece of armor she owned. Jonathan Hale had promised to speak to her father. That was the phrase he had used. Speak to your father. Not propose. Not ask for her hand in the formal language of the society they both moved through. Just speak to him. As though what he intended to communicate was so obvious, so settled, so entirely a matter of course, that it required no ceremony. Eleanor had believed him. She had believed him for 2 years. She had believed him through the letters he wrote when he traveled north to New York on family business letters that were not poetic, but were consistent, and consistency had always mattered more to Eleanor than poetry. She had believed him through the Sunday services, where he stood beside her, and the way the other women in the congregation watched them with that particular look, the look that meant they have an understanding. She had believed him through her mother's quiet satisfaction and her father's careful, cautious hope, and the small, private way she had allowed herself to imagine what her life might look like in 5 years and 10. A house. Children. Something stable. Something hers. She had not been naive. She had simply been wrong. The Richmond Society House was lit from every window that night, and the sound of the string quartet inside reached her before she even climbed the front steps. Her father offered his arm at the bottom of the stairs. Thomas Whitmore, a man who had once been considerable and was now merely respectable, which in Virginia society was almost the same as invisible, and Eleanor took it without needing to steady herself. She was steady. She was always steady. It was, she had long since decided, the most useful thing she knew how to be. Inside the room was everything Richmond believed itself to be. Women in summer silks moved like slow flowers around the floor. Men in dark coats gathered near the east wall with their glasses and their opinions. The heat was enormous despite the open windows, and the candles along the mantelpiece had already begun to tilt sideways in their holders from the warmth. Eleanor saw Jonathan almost immediately. He was standing near the center of the room, and he was not alone. The woman beside him was named Amelia Worthington. Eleanor knew her by sight. Everyone in Richmond knew the Worthingtons by sight, because Marcus Worthington had made a very large fortune in shipping and had arrived in Virginia society 3 years ago with the cheerful, unstoppable energy of a man who understood that money applied with sufficient enthusiasm eventually became indistinguishable from old standing. Amelia was his only daughter. She was also, Eleanor observed in the single clear-eyed second before the full understanding arrived, wearing a ring on her left hand that had not been there the last time Eleanor had seen her. Eleanor's father felt her stop. "Eleanor," he said quietly. "I see it," she said. She did not move for a moment. She simply stood at the edge of the room and looked at Jonathan Hale, at the way he was laughing at something Amelia had said. The easy, uncomplicated laugh of a man who had made his decision and felt entirely comfortable with it, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she had never actually been part of his future. She had been a placeholder, a presence he had kept comfortable and convenient until something better arranged itself. That understanding did not destroy her in that moment. It would destroy her later in private in the small hours of the night when no one was watching. But in that moment, standing at the edge of the Richmond Society House with her mother's ivory lace pressed against her collarbone, Eleanor Whitmore did what she had always done. She composed herself, she took a breath, and she walked into the room. She had almost made it to the far side, almost reached the relative safety of the refreshment table, and the older women who gathered there, and whose conversations required nothing from her but polite attention when Jonathan turned and saw her. His expression did something complicated. Not guilt. She had been hoping for guilt. What she saw instead was something closer to relief, the look of a man who had been anticipating an awkward moment and was now deciding how to manage it with the least possible inconvenience to himself. He excused himself from Amelia's side and crossed toward Eleanor directly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I am glad you came." Eleanor looked at him. "Mr. Hale." He glanced once behind him at Amelia, who was now watching with polite attention, and then back at Eleanor. "I had intended to call on your father this week," he said, "to explain." "There is nothing that requires explanation," Eleanor said. "I think there is." He lowered his voice, which she supposed was meant to be considerate. "Eleanor, you are an admirable woman. I want you to understand that. But my family's position requires—" "I understand perfectly," she said. "I don't think you do." And here something shifted in his voice. Something that was not quite cruelty, but was close enough that the difference barely mattered. "You are a fine woman, Eleanor, but fine is not sufficient for what my family needs. The Whitmore name carries respect, certainly. But respect without means is a difficult thing to build upon." The room around them had not gone silent. Not yet. But Eleanor was aware with the particular finely tuned awareness of a woman who had spent 20 years learning to read a room that several people nearby had oriented themselves toward this conversation. That fans had slowed. That the woman directly to her left had stopped pretending to examine the refreshment table. "You were never truly suitable," Jonathan said. Not cruelly. That was almost the worst part, the way he said it without cruelty, as though it were simply a fact he was delivering a matter of arithmetic. "Not for the future I am building. I regret that this was not made clear sooner." Eleanor heard someone to her left take a small breath. She heard a soft sound from somewhere behind her that might have been a suppressed laugh. She looked at Jonathan Hale, at his pleasant, self-assured face, at the ring on his finger that she had only just noticed, at the careful, managed expression of a man who had decided that honesty delivered without emotion was the same as kindness. And she felt something move through her that she would not name until much later. It was not grief. Grief she had felt before. It was something colder. Something that settled into her spine and hardened there. "Thank you," she said, "for the clarity." She did not wait for him to respond. She turned carefully without hurry and walked to the far edge of the room. She did not look back. She did not look at the faces that had watched the exchange. She found a chair near the window where the faint evening air moved through the curtain, and she sat down, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked out at the darkness outside, and she breathed. Her father found her 20 minutes later. "We should go," he said. "Not yet," she said. "If we leave now, they will know it affected me." Thomas Whitmore looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he sat down beside her, and he did not say anything, and that was the kindest thing anyone did for her that entire evening. The talk lasted for weeks. Richmond was not a large city in the way that Philadelphia or New York were large. It was a city of layers of interlocking families and long memories, and the particular social cruelty of a community small enough that everyone knew exactly what everyone else had lost. The story of what Jonathan Hale had said to Eleanor Whitmore at the Society House spread in the way these stories always spread in whispers over tea in carefully worded letters in the raised eyebrow of a woman across a church aisle. It was not malicious exactly. It was simply the way things moved through a place like Richmond. Information was currency. And Eleanor's humiliation was for a certain kind of person enormously valuable. She bore it the way she bore most things. Quietly. Practically. She did not stop attending services, or the small afternoon gatherings her mother organized, or the occasional larger events that their remaining social position obligated them to attend. She showed up, and she was composed, and she answered questions with the minimum information required, and she gave no one anything useful to carry away with them. She became, in a very deliberate way, uninteresting. It was not difficult. She had always known how to make herself small when smallness was the safest shape to take. But something had changed in her. She knew it. Her mother knew it. Even her father, who was not a particularly observant man in matters of emotional temperature, noticed it in the way she began to manage the household accounts without being asked. Taking over the ledgers, renegotiating the contract with the feed merchant, selling 3 pieces of silver plate that had been sitting unused in the back of the pantry cupboard for 15 years. She became, in the 2 years following the Richmond Society House, very practical. She stopped imagining. She stopped planning for a future that depended on another person's choice. She decided that survival was a skill, and she would master it. It was in the second summer, the summer of 1816, when the heat came earlier than usual and lay over Virginia like something alive, that Alexander Blackwood arrived in Richmond. He did not arrive with fanfare, which surprised people. A man of his position might reasonably have been expected to arrive with fanfare. The Blackwood name was not merely well known in Virginia, it was the kind of name that made other well-known names feel slightly less significant by comparison. Alexander Blackwood controlled more acreage in the Commonwealth than any other private landholder. His shipping interests stretched from Charleston up through Baltimore. His timber operations in the western counties provided lumber to half the building projects in the region. He was, by any reasonable measurement, the most powerful private citizen in Virginia, and possibly in several of the surrounding states. He was also, as Eleanor learned from the steady stream of information her mother delivered over breakfast on the morning of his arrival, 34 years old, unmarried, and in Richmond, for reasons that no one had yet been able to establish with certainty. Margaret Carver says he is looking to acquire the Hendricks property on the South Road, her mother said, refilling her own tea with the studied casualness of a woman who had a great deal more to say. But Charlotte Beale's husband spoke with his man of business last week and says that is not the reason at all. What does Mr. Beale's assessment suggest? Eleanor asked, because her mother would tell her regardless, and it was simpler to ask. That he is looking for a wife. Eleanor looked up from the household ledger she had been reviewing. A wife. A wife, her mother confirmed. He is 34. His family has been pressing the matter for years, from what I understand. And apparently, here, her mother set down the teapot and looked at Eleanor with the careful, tentative expression she had worn increasingly often in the past 2 years. Apparently, he has made inquiries. About what? Her mother said nothing. Mama. About you, her mother said quietly. Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the columns of numbers she had been adding and re-adding for the past hour, at the careful, honest arithmetic of a household operating at the very edge of its means. She thought about the accounts that needed settling before winter. She thought about her father's health, which had not been strong since the previous autumn. She thought about her younger sister Clara, who was 16 and would need a season in 2 years, and a dowry she had no idea yet did not exist. She thought about Jonathan Hale saying fine is not sufficient. Tell me, she said, what you know about him. Duh. She met Alexander Blackwood 4 days later at a small gathering hosted by the Carver family. He was not what she had constructed in her imagination. She had built him in the preceding 4 days from the materials available, the description her mother had offered, tall, dark-haired, serious-looking, the opinions various Richmond women had provided. Cold, difficult, brilliant, impossible to read. And the man she had assembled from those pieces was somewhat theatrical. A villain-shaped man, sharp-edged and deliberate, and a little frightening. The man who crossed the Carver's drawing room toward her was frightening, but not in the theatrical way. He was frightening in the way that very competent, very focused people were frightening, the way a judge was frightening, not because he raised his voice, but because he did not need to. He was tall. He moved without any of the self-conscious deliberateness that men of his position often performed, no lingering pauses to allow others to observe him, no surveying of the room for effect. He simply moved through it the way a man moved through a space he had decided to occupy, and the room quietly reorganized itself around him without anyone appearing to notice they were doing it. He stopped in front of her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. He studied her for a moment. Not in the way men sometimes studied women at social gatherings, the quick assessing look that moved from face to figure and back again. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a ledger or a contract, carefully, with attention to the things that were actually there rather than the things he had expected to find. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries," he said. "I understand you are a practical woman." "I have been called that," she said. It was meant as a compliment. I took it as one. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not a smile, she would learn over the following months that he did not smile easily or often, but a small, almost imperceptible adjustment, as though something had confirmed something else. "I have a proposition," he said. "I would prefer to discuss it plainly, rather than through the usual social machinery. I find the usual social machinery inefficient." "I find it exhausting," Eleanor said. "Then we agree on something already." He looked at her steadily. "I require a wife, not a decorative one. I have no interest in decoration. I require someone capable of managing a large household, of representing my interests in social situations. I do not always have time to attend myself, of making decisions independently and well. I have been told you are capable of all of these things." Eleanor looked at him. "You have done your research." "I do not make significant decisions without research," he said. "That is not how I have built what I have built." "And what have you built, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. Not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to hear how he answered. He did not list his holdings. He did not enumerate his acreage, or his shipping routes, or his timber interests. He said, "A great deal of work that requires a partner." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Around them, the Carvers' drawing room continued its gentle social hum. Somewhere across the room, Margaret Carver was watching them with the barely concealed fascination of a woman witnessing something she would be discussing for the next 6 months. Eleanor was aware of it. She was aware of all of it. "I will be honest with you in return," she said. "I would prefer nothing less. I am not what this society would consider a favorable match. My family's means are limited. My reputation has sustained damage in the past 2 years that certain people in this room would be happy to describe to you if you asked. I do not bring wealth or extensive connection. What I bring is exactly what you've described: competence and practicality, and the ability to manage difficult things without requiring assistance." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am aware of your circumstances," he said. "I told you I do research." "Then you understand what I'm telling you." "I understand that you are warning me," he said. "I do not require the warning. I made my assessment before I crossed this room." A pause. "Miss Whitmore, I am asking you to consider an arrangement that is honest rather than romantic. I believe you will find that honesty over time is considerably more durable." Eleanor thought about the Richmond Society house, about the candles tilting in their holders, about the sound of a soft laugh from somewhere behind her left shoulder. She thought about her father's accounts, and her sister's future, and the silver plate she had sold for $12 less than it was worth, because the buyer had known she was not in a position to refuse. She thought about what she had decided 2 years ago about survival. "I will consider it," she said. "That is all I am asking," he said. He inclined his head, not a bow exactly, but a gesture that acknowledged something. And then he turned and moved back through the room, and the room reorganized itself around his departure, the same way it had reorganized itself around his arrival. Eleanor stood very still. She looked down at her hands. She thought, "This is not what I imagined for my life." And then she thought what I imagined was wrong. She gave him her answer 6 days later, delivered through her father as propriety required. Yes, she would accept the arrangement. She had 3 conditions which she had written down in the household ledger, and then transferred to a separate sheet of paper in her best hand that her family's debts be settled, that her sister's dowry be secured before the wedding, and that Eleanor herself be given management of the domestic household from the first day of their marriage with full authority over its operation and accounts. Her father had read the list twice and then looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something between admiration and grief. "Eleanor," he said. "Those are my terms," she said. He delivered them. Alexander Blackwood accepted all three without negotiation. The wedding was arranged for September. Quiet, practical. Exactly what had been agreed. Eleanor pressed her mother's ivory lace the night before and thought about none of the things she had once imagined pressing it for. She thought instead about what came next. She had always been better at next than at before. The wedding took place on a Tuesday. Eleanor had expected that detail to feel significant the day of the week. The particular quality of the September morning. The way the light came through the church windows at an angle she would remember. She had expected some interior ceremony to accompany the external one. Some private reckoning with what she was doing and what it meant and what she was leaving behind. Instead, she stood at the altar beside Alexander Blackwood and thought about the household accounts. She thought about the list she had made the previous evening, things to address in the first week. Things that could wait until the second, things she would need to discuss with the housekeeper before she could assess what the Blackwood estate actually required of her. She thought about her sister Clara's face that morning, the way Clara had held her hands too tightly before they left for the church, and hadn't said anything because Clara was 16 and understood more than she was supposed to understand. She thought about her father standing at the back of the church with the careful, upright posture of a man holding himself together by will alone. She did not think about Jonathan Hale. She had decided some weeks earlier that Jonathan Hale was no longer a thing she would spend thought on. He had cost her enough already. She was done paying. The minister said the words. Alexander said his part clearly, without hesitation, without any particular warmth, but also without any performance of warmth, which Eleanor found unexpectedly to be a relief. She said her own part in return. When it was done, Alexander looked at her with that careful assessing expression she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things. He was taking seriously, and he offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked out of the church into the September heat, and that was that. They were married, practical, quiet, exactly what had been agreed. The Blackwood estate sat 14 miles south of Richmond, and Eleanor saw it for the first time that afternoon from the window of the carriage. It was large. She had known it would be large. She had done her own research in the weeks between accepting the arrangement and the wedding, because she was not a woman who walked into significant situations without information, but knowing a thing and seeing it were different experiences. The house itself was built in the federal style, 3 stories of red brick, with white trim, set back from the road at the end of a long drive lined with old oak trees whose canopies had grown together overhead into a tunnel of green shade. She thought, I can work with this. That was her first thought about her new home. Not wonder, not intimidation, not grief for the home she had come from. Simply an assessment, an orientation toward what was possible. Alexander was watching her. Well, he said. It is a serious house, she said. It is, he agreed. Is that an endorsement or a concern? It is an observation, she said. I will tell you which it is once I have seen the inside. He said nothing. But again that small adjustment in his expression, that faint shift that she was slowly learning to read the way she read other people's smiles. It meant he had noted something, filed it somewhere. She did not yet know what he did with the things he filed. The housekeeper's name was Mrs. Ruth Harding, and she had managed the Blackwood household for 11 years, and had very clear opinions about how things were done. Eleanor understood this within approximately 4 minutes of their introduction. Mrs. Harding was not rude. She was scrupulously not rude in the particular way of a woman who has made a professional decision to withhold her rudeness while communicating it through other means. The slight over-precision of her explanations, the way she described existing systems with an emphasis on the word existing, the careful neutrality of her expression, when Eleanor asked a question that suggested Eleanor might be considering changing something. Eleanor had dealt with women like Mrs. Harding before. She had been, in a certain sense, preparing to deal with women like Mrs. Harding her entire life. "Mrs. Harding," she said on the second morning when they sat down together to review the household accounts, "I want to be plain with you because I think you will appreciate plain." "Of course, ma'am," said Mrs. Harding with the expression of a woman who was reserving judgment. "You have run this house well for 11 years. That is evident. I am not here to dismantle what works. I am here to understand what is here and to manage it going forward. That is what Mr. Blackwood has asked of me, and that is what I intend to do." Eleanor looked at the ledger open between them. "I will need you to walk me through these figures honestly, including the things that are difficult, including the places where corners have been cut or problems have been deferred. I am not looking for perfection. I am looking for accuracy." Mrs. Harding looked at her for a long moment. "The north wing roof," she said, "has needed repair for 2 seasons. Then we will address the north wing roof," Eleanor said. "What else?" Something shifted in Mrs. Harding's expression. Not warmth that would take longer, but something that was the beginning of a decision. "The kitchen stores were ordered by the previous arrangement, meaning Mr. Blackwood's man of business placed orders without consulting the cook, and the cook has been managing with what arrives rather than what is needed." "Who is the cook?" "Josephine. She has been here 15 years. "I would like to speak with Josephine this afternoon," Eleanor said. "And from this point forward, the kitchen stores will be ordered through Josephine, reviewed by me, and approved before they are placed. Is that manageable?" Mrs. Harding looked at the ledger. She looked at Eleanor. She said, "Yes, ma'am. That is manageable." It was not friendship. It was the beginning of something more durable than friendship. The mutual recognition of 2 practical women who had decided to work in the same direction. Alexander was away 3 days out of every 7 on average. Eleanor learned this in the first 2 weeks and organized her life around it without comment. He rode to Richmond, to the shipping offices in Petersburg, to the timber operations in the western counties. He moved through the machinery of his holdings, the way a man moves through rooms he owns, with the comfortable authority of someone who has never had to ask permission for anything. When he was home, he worked in his study from early morning until the household gathered for the evening meal. And at the evening meal he was present but not loquacious, and after the meal he returned to his study or walked the grounds in the long summer dusk, and Eleanor did not follow him, and he did not invite her. She had not expected anything different. What she had not expected, what surprised her quietly, in the way that small things surprised her, was that he noticed things. She had been in the house 9 days when she rearranged the household's linen inventory, redistributing the worn pieces to the servants' quarters, and identifying 12 sets that needed replacing before winter. She had not mentioned this to Alexander, because it did not require his attention. It was exactly the kind of domestic management she had been brought in to perform, and she performed it and moved on to the next thing. 2 days later, at the evening meal, he said, "Mrs. Harding mentioned the linen situation has been addressed." "It has," Eleanor said. "I have ordered replacements from the Hendricks dry goods account. The cost is in the household ledger if you want to review it." "I don't need to review it," he said. She looked up. "I gave you authority over the household accounts," he said. "I meant it." She held his gaze for a moment. "Most men say they mean it and then look over your shoulder anyway. I am not most men," he said without particular emphasis, just as a statement of fact, the way he stated most things. Eleanor looked back down at her plate. She thought, "No, you are not." She did not say it. The first real conversation they had, the first one that was not about household management or scheduling or the practical logistics of their arrangement, happened in the 4th week on a Wednesday evening, when the heat had finally broken enough to make the back porch bearable, and Eleanor had taken her mending outside to catch the last of the daylight. She did not hear him come out. She was focused on the shirt she was repairing. It was one of her father's, which she had brought from home to finish, because the old man's hands had gotten worse in the autumn cold, and her mother couldn't manage the fine work anymore, and she did not look up until Alexander sat down in the other chair. She looked up then. He had a glass of water and a letter he had apparently just finished reading, which he folded and set on the small table between them. He did not explain his presence. He simply sat. "Is that your father's?" he said, looking at the shirt. "Yes," she said. "His hands." She looked at him. She had not mentioned her father's hands to anyone. "Mrs. Harding," she said. "She mentioned your mother had written," he said. "I was not prying. I know," she said. After a moment, "Yes, his hands have been troubling him since last winter. He can't manage the finer work anymore, and my mother's eyes aren't what they were." Alexander said nothing for a moment. Then, "I will arrange for Dr. Harlow to call on them next week. He is the best physician in the county. He attends my affairs." Eleanor looked at him. "That is not necessary. It is if I say it is," he said. Then after a beat, "I do not mean that the way it sounded. I mean it costs me nothing, and it addresses a problem. That is sufficient reason." She set down the mending. "Why do you do that?" she said. "Do what?" "You say something that could be taken as high-handed, and then you explain that it isn't. You've done it 4 times since we married." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, not discomfort exactly. Something more like recognition. "Because I am aware," he said, "that I have a tendency to manage situations in a way that can feel like dismissal. I am attempting to correct for that. With me specifically or in general, with everyone, he said. But I am most aware of it with you." The evening air moved through the porch. Somewhere in the yard, one of the horses shifted in its stall. Eleanor picked up the mending again and took 2 stitches before she said, "Why more aware with me?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because you are paying attention. Most people around me have stopped paying attention to what I actually say. They hear what they expect from a man in my position, and they respond to that. You hear what I say." Eleanor considered this. "That must be strange, to have people respond to what they expect rather than what you say." "It is inefficient," he said. She almost smiled. "Is that the word you would choose?" "It is the accurate word," he said. And then, and this was what she thought about later, lying awake in the dark of her room, he said, "What word would you choose?" She thought about it honestly. "Lonely," she said. "I think I would find it lonely." He was very still for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That is the more accurate word." What? She did not know what to do with that. She put it away in the careful internal storage she had developed over years of managing things that couldn't be immediately addressed, and she went on with the work of the household and the practical requirements of their arrangement. And she told herself that one honest conversation did not constitute a change in the nature of what they were to each other. She told herself that. She was not entirely sure she believed it. October arrived, and with it the social season in Richmond, which meant a series of obligations that Eleanor had not fully anticipated, or rather had anticipated in the abstract, but not in the particular weight of them. She was now Eleanor Blackwood. That name attached to that man in that society meant something very different than Eleanor Whitmore had ever meant. She understood this the first time she walked into the Carver drawing room with Alexander beside her, and watched the room reorient itself in real time, the way attention shifted, the way conversations paused, the way certain women who had once looked past her now looked directly at her, and recalculated whatever calculation they were running. It should have felt satisfying. In some small honest part of herself, it did feel satisfying. She was not going to pretend otherwise. But it also felt like wearing a different woman's clothes. Like the status she now occupied had been manufactured entirely outside of herself, which it had been because she had married into it, which was exactly the bargain she had made, and she had made it with clear eyes. She understood that. She had no illusions about it. What she had not fully anticipated was what it would feel like to stand inside a room that had once made her small, and find that she was no longer small in it, and to know that the change had nothing to do with who she had become, and everything to do with whose name she was carrying. She was thinking about this at the Carver gathering in mid-October, standing near the window with a glass of cider she wasn't drinking when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Well," Mrs. Blackwood." She turned. Jonathan Hale was standing 4 feet away. Beside him was Amelia, who was visibly pregnant, and watching Eleanor with an expression that was doing a great deal of work trying to be pleasant. Jonathan himself was smiling, the same smile. That particular self-assured arrangement of features that she had once believed meant something and now recognized as simply the default expression of a man who had never had sufficient cause to doubt himself. "Mr. Hale," she said. "I had heard the news," he said. "I confess I was surprised. Blackwood." He said the name as though tasting it. "That was an unexpected development." "Life often is," she said. "Indeed." He glanced around the room, perhaps looking for Alexander, perhaps simply performing the ease of a man in his natural habitat. "Is your husband here this evening?" "He will be shortly," she said. Which was true. Alexander had been detained by a conversation with Franklin Carver near the door and would cross the room to her within the next few minutes. She knew his patterns by now. "Ah," Jonathan looked at her. "You know, Eleanor, may I still call you Eleanor?" "You may call me Mrs. Blackwood," she said pleasantly, a small, almost imperceptible flinch. "Mrs. Blackwood, then. I hope you know that I bear you no ill will. What passed between us, it was business. You understand that." "I understand it perfectly," she said. "Good." He seemed to settle into himself. "Because I think we are both sensible people, and sensible people understand that these decisions are not personal." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "You told a room full of people that I was mediocre, Jonathan, in those precise words, and you did it in a way that ensured the maximum number of witnesses. That is a very particular kind of not personal." His smile did not disappear, but something behind it did. "I may have been less careful with my phrasing than I should have been," he said. "You may have been," she agreed. "But surely you can see, Jonathan." She said his name quietly, without heat, without anger, simply as a word that meant stop. "I don't require an apology from you. I genuinely don't. What I would ask is that you not pretend to me or to yourself that what you did was anything other than what it was. You made your choice. It was your right to make it. But the way you made it was unkind, and we both know it, and I think we will get along considerably better in the future if we simply acknowledge that and move on." Amelia had stopped pretending not to listen. Jonathan's smile was entirely gone now. He started. "Mrs. Blackwood." Alexander's voice came from directly behind her. She had not heard him cross the room. He moved quietly for a man his size, which she had noticed before. And now, he was there, his hand settling at the small of her back, with a calm, deliberate weight that communicated something to the room without requiring any words. He looked at Jonathan, with the expression she was coming to understand was his most dangerous one. Not cold, not hostile, simply, completely, and entirely unimpressed. "Hale," he said. Jonathan straightened. Something happened to his face, a scrambling, she thought, a rapid internal reorganization. "Blackwood. I was just Mrs. Blackwood, and I were acquainted before." "I know who you are," Alexander said. The words were perfectly level. "I know the nature of your previous acquaintance with my wife." A pause. "Is there something I can help you with this evening?" "I was simply—" "Because if not," Alexander said, "I believe my wife and I have other people to speak with." Jonathan Hale stood in front of Alexander Blackwood for approximately 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, every social calculation that Jonathan had ever made, every confidence he had built on the foundation of his family's name, and his own easy charm, and the general willingness of the world to accommodate him, Eleanor watched all of it meet something it couldn't move and fail to move it. "Of course," Jonathan said. "Good evening." He took Amelia's arm and steered them both away. Amelia glanced back once. Eleanor did not follow the glance. Alexander's hand was still at the small of her back. He said quietly for her alone, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, I had already handled it. "I know," he said. "I heard the last of it." She looked at him. "Then why?" Because he needed to see it wasn't only you saying it, he said. Men like that, they hear a woman's words differently when there's no one standing with her. I was simply standing with you. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Around them, the Carver drawing room had resumed its social hum. People had noted what had happened and processed it, and moved on the way rooms did, when they had witnessed something they weren't quite sure what to do with. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. It was the correct thing to do. She almost laughed. Not at him, at the straightforwardness of it, the undecorated logic. It was the correct thing to do, and so he had done it, and that was the entirety of his accounting for the action. No performance, no expectation of gratitude, no positioning of himself as her defender for the pleasure of occupying that role. Just it was right. So he did it. She thought, walking beside him toward the other side of the room. "I do not know what to do with you, Alexander Blackwood." She thought it again later that evening when he handed her into the carriage, and the night air came off the James River cool and dark, and smelling of autumn, and he sat across from her in the dark and didn't say anything, and that silence was the most comfortable silence she had experienced in years. November deepened the cold and brought with it a series of letters from her mother that Eleanor read carefully and answered practically and set aside. Clara's debut was being discussed. Her father's hands were improving. The physician Alexander had sent had adjusted his treatment, and the results were already showing. Her mother wrote, "I do not know how to account for your husband's generosity, except to say that it has been consistent, and I find myself revising my reservations about the whole arrangement." Eleanor wrote back, "Your reservations were reasonable. I shared them. I am still in the process of revising my own." She did not send that letter. She wrote another one that said her mother's news was a great relief and that she hoped the improvement would continue. But she kept the first one, folded it, and put it in the back of the household ledger behind the accounts for December. She was not ready to send it. She was not sure what she would be ready for when she was ready. But she was. She admitted to herself, in the private accounting she kept as carefully as she kept any other accounting, in the process of revising something. She could feel it happening, the way you could feel a season change. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small, undeniable shifts, one after another. Until one morning, you looked up and realized the thing you had been moving through had moved. Shao. It was the question of the harvest ledger that broke something open between them. Alexander had been reviewing the annual accounts for the estate, a process that normally fell to his man of business, a precise and competent man named Emmett Davies, who had handled the Blackwood accounts for 6 years. Eleanor had noticed in her review of the household records a discrepancy in the autumn grain figures, not a large one, but consistent across 3 years, always in the same category, always in a direction that favored the same merchant. She had noted it and said nothing for 2 weeks, because she was uncertain whether it was her place to raise it, and she was still learning the boundaries of her authority here. Then she decided that was not who she was going to be in this house. She was not going to be a woman who noticed something important and stayed quiet about it because she was uncertain of her footing. She brought the ledger to Alexander's study on a Thursday morning, knocked, and waited for him to answer before she entered. "I have found something in the harvest accounts," she said. "I may be wrong. I am not an expert in agricultural commerce, but I think you should look at it." He looked up from what he was working on. He looked at her, that careful, attentive look, and then he said, "Show me." She opened the ledger on his desk and walked him through the figures. She showed him the pattern, 3 years, same category, same merchant, consistent variance of approximately 6%, in a direction that was not in the Blackwood estate's favor. She showed him her calculation of the cumulative loss, which was not trivial. Alexander was very still for a long moment. "Davies has managed these accounts for 6 years, he said. "Yes," she said. "You are telling me this has been happening for at least 3 of those years." "At minimum," she said. "I only reviewed the past 3. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the figures. He said nothing for a full minute, and Eleanor stood across the desk from him and waited, because she had learned by now that his silence was not absence. It was processing and interrupting. It was wasteful. Then he looked up at her. You could have brought this to Davies directly. I could have, she said, but it involves Davies, and I thought you should know before anyone else had the opportunity to respond to it. Something in his expression shifted in a way she had not seen before, and it took her a moment to identify it, because it was not an expression she had seen on many people's faces when they looked at her. It was not approval exactly. It was something closer to trust, the specific, rare, weighty thing that happens when someone does something that reveals they understand not just the practical situation, but the deeper structure of it. The loyalty required, the judgment applied. Eleanor, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the Mrs. in front of it. She was not sure he was aware of it. The matter with Davies, he said. I will handle it, but I want you to know. He stopped, started again. This was not a small thing what you brought to me. Most people in your position would not have looked closely enough to see it, or would have been too uncertain of their standing to raise it. You did both. She looked at him. I noticed something that mattered. It would have been wrong not to say so. Yes, he said. It would have been. And then more quietly. Thank you, genuinely. She nodded. She turned to leave. She was at the door when he said, Eleanor. She stopped. Stay, he said, and then before she could respond more carefully, for dinner. I mean, will you have dinner with me this evening in the study? There are some decisions I need to think through regarding the Western County operations, and I find I want another perspective. Yours specifically. She turned back. He was looking at her with that careful, attentive expression. And underneath it, very quiet, very controlled, the way everything about this man was controlled, she could see something else. Something that had not been there, or that she had not been able to see in the early weeks. Something that looked very much like wanting company. Wanting her company, not her management, not her competence. Her. She thought about the letter she had written and not sent. I am still in the process of revising my own. Yes, she said. I'll stay. The dinner in the study happened again the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. It was not discussed or arranged in any formal way. It simply became a thing that happened. Alexander would finish whatever he was working on around 6 in the evening, and Eleanor would have already spoken with Josephine about what was available. And the food would arrive on a tray, and they would sit on opposite sides of his desk with the ledgers and correspondence pushed to one side, and they would eat and talk. Sometimes the talking was business, the Western County operations, the spring planting decisions, a dispute with a neighboring landowner over a water access easement that Alexander was navigating with the patience of a man who knew he would win and saw no reason to accelerate the timeline unnecessarily. Sometimes it was not business. Sometimes it was simply conversation, the kind that moves from one thing to another without a clear path, the kind that reveals things about a person not through what they say directly, but through what they choose to mention, what they laugh at, what they go quiet over. Eleanor learned that Alexander had taught himself to read Latin at the age of 12 from a book he had found in his father's library and had never told anyone about because it had seemed at the time like a private pleasure he did not want examined. She learned that he had a younger brother in Philadelphia, whom he was close to in the specific, infrequent way of men who care deeply and demonstrate it through action rather than contact. She learned that he had been engaged once before at 26 to a woman from a Charleston family, and that the engagement had ended when the woman had decided with considerable courage that she did not actually want the life that marrying him would require, the management, the expectations, the particular loneliness of being partnered to a man whose work consumed most of what he had. She was right. Alexander said the evening he told Eleanor this. About all of it. I did not understand it at the time. I thought the problem was her. It took me several years to understand that the problem was me, or rather the specific demands of what I had built and what it required of the person beside me. What changed? Eleanor asked. I became more honest about what I was offering, he said, instead of asking someone to accept a version of this arrangement that was dressed up to look like something else. Eleanor looked at him. Like what? Like courtship, he said. Like romance. like the ordinary progression of a man pursuing a woman for ordinary reasons. He was quiet for a moment. I offered you something different, an honest accounting, and you accepted it with clear eyes. I had clear eyes by necessity, she said. I know. He looked at her directly. That is one of the things I respect most about you. She held his gaze. The fire had burned down to low coals, and the study was warm and close, and the house around them was quiet in the particular deep way it got after 10 o'clock, when the staff had retired. Alexander, she said. What are we doing? He did not pretend not to understand the question. I don't know, he said. I told you this would be an honest arrangement. I find that the honest answer to your question is that I don't know. That is not very satisfying. No, he agreed. It isn't. She nodded. She looked down at the correspondence in front of her, a letter she had been helping him draft to the water easement neighbor, measured and precise and impossible to argue with. She picked up the pen. Then we continue, she said. Yes, he said. We continue. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was simply two people deciding to keep moving in the same direction, and somehow, for reasons Eleanor was only beginning to understand, that felt more solid than most declarations she had encountered. December arrived with the first hard frost and a letter from her mother that made Eleanor set down her tea and sit very still for a long moment. Her father had collapsed, not fatally. Her mother was careful to establish this immediately in the first line, perhaps anticipating Eleanor's response, but seriously enough that Dr. Harlow had been called twice in 3 days and had left instructions for complete rest and a reduction in any activity that might cause stress or strain. Thomas Whitmore was 61 years old and had been declining slowly and steadily in the way that men of his generation and constitution often declined incrementally, almost invisibly, until one morning the increment was too large to ignore. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she went to Alexander's study. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in. He saw her face, whatever her face was doing, whatever it revealed, despite her best efforts, and he put down his pen. What happened? He said. She told him. She was precise about it. She gave him the medical information her mother had provided, the timeline, the physician's instructions. She did not cry. She did not ask for anything. She was laying out facts the way she laid out all facts because that was how she managed things she could not immediately fix. When she finished, Alexander said, "Do you want to go to him?" She looked at him. Yes. But there are things here that require Eleanor. His voice was quiet, but it stopped her. Do you want to go to your father? Yes, she said. Then go. He said it without hesitation. I will arrange the carriage for tomorrow morning. Mrs. Harding can manage the household for a week. The accounts can wait. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. I am choosing to. He paused. Then, would it help if I came with you? She had not expected that. She had not expected any of this. The immediacy of his response, the complete absence of any calculation about inconvenience or disruption. She stood in his study, and she looked at the man she had married for practical reasons, the man she had chosen with clear eyes and no illusions, and she felt something shift in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Yes, she said quietly. It would help. He was at her parents' house by 11 the following morning. He did not sweep in. He did not perform authority or generosity in any observable way. He spoke to Dr. Harlow with the quiet precision of a man who understood that medical information was more useful than medical reassurance, and he came away from that conversation with a clear picture of what Thomas Whitmore needed and a list of 3 things he intended to arrange. He sat with her father for 20 minutes in the afternoon. Eleanor watched from the doorway, had not been able to make herself leave, and he talked to him the way she had slowly learned he talked to everyone directly without condescension, as though the other person was fully capable of handling the information being exchanged. Her father, from his bed with his hands that couldn't fully close anymore, looked at Alexander Blackwood and said, "You are not what I expected." I am told that regularly, Alexander said. Her father almost smiled. Eleanor is not what most people expect either. I know, Alexander said. It is one of the things I find most useful about her. Her father's almost smile became a real one. Useful, he repeated. And other things, Alexander said. But useful first. Eleanor in the doorway looked at the ceiling and breathed very carefully through her nose. They stayed 3 days. On the second evening, her mother, Margaret Whitmore, who had opinions about everything and the will to express them, and had raised Eleanor to do the same, cornered Eleanor in the kitchen, while Josephine's substitute, a local girl named Hattie, cleaned up after supper. He loves you, her mother said with the directness of a woman who had been waiting to say this for approximately 48 hours. Mama, I am not saying it to be sentimental. I am saying it because I have watched him for 2 days and it is the only explanation for his behavior that makes any sense. Her mother looked at her steadily. He did not come here for duty. He did not come here to perform the role of attentive husband. He came here because you needed to be here, and he did not want you to be here alone. Eleanor looked at the table. We have an arrangement. Eleanor Ann Whitmore. Blackwood, Eleanor said. Eleanor Ann Blackwood. Her mother sat down across from her. You are my daughter. I know every face you make. And I have watched you for 2 days not letting yourself look at him the way you want to look at him, because you have decided that the arrangement is the boundary, and you will not cross it first. A pause. Am I wrong? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. No, she said. Then stop being so careful, her mother said. Careful is what you do when you are afraid. You are not afraid of that man. I am a little afraid of that man, Eleanor said honestly. Her mother looked at her. Then unexpectedly she reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hands with her own. That kind of afraid is allowed, she said gently. That kind of afraid means it matters. They returned to the estate on a Friday afternoon, and the house felt different when Eleanor walked back into it. She could not have explained why. Nothing had changed in her absence. Mrs. Harding had managed impeccably, as Eleanor had known she would, and the household was exactly as she had left it. But something had changed in her relationship to the space. Something in how it felt to walk back into it with Alexander beside her, to hand her coat to the housemaid, and hear the sounds of the working house resuming around them. It felt, she thought, like returning. Not like returning to a place, like returning to something. She did not examine that thought closely. She put it away in the back of the household ledger with the letter she had never sent, and she went to check on the December accounts. The Richmond Grand Winter Ball was held in the 3rd week of January, and Eleanor had been anticipating it with the particular combination of calm and readiness she brought to all social events she knew would be complicated. She was not wrong about the complication. It was the largest event of the season. The Whitfield family hosted it every year in their house on Franklin Street, which was the largest private home in Richmond, and had a ballroom that could accommodate 200 without strain. Everyone came. That was the point. Everyone came, and everyone saw everyone, and the accumulated social intelligence of the Virginia upper class was updated in a single evening in ways that would take months to play out in their consequences. Eleanor dressed carefully. She wore dark green silk, one of 3 new gowns that had appeared in her wardrobe 6 weeks into the marriage, ordered and paid for by Alexander without discussion, because he had observed that she owned nothing appropriate for the social obligations his position created, and had addressed the problem the same way he addressed all problems, directly and without ceremony. She had wanted to object. She had not, because he was right, and objecting to a correct solution on principle was a thing she had no patience for in other people, and tried not to indulge in herself. Alexander came to find her when the carriage was ready. He stopped in the doorway of her room, knocked, first, always knocked, and looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. You look very well, he said. Thank you, she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They went downstairs. In the carriage on the way to Franklin Street, Alexander said, Hale will be there tonight. I know, she said. I want you to know that if you would prefer to leave at any point, you need only say so. She looked at him. I don't want to leave. He looked back. All right. I am done, she said, letting Jonathan Hale determine where I am and am not comfortable. Something moved in Alexander's expression. Not satisfaction, something deeper than satisfaction. Something that looked like pride, the specific, ungovernable kind that comes when you watch someone you care about do something difficult with grace. All right, he said again more quietly. The Whitfield Ballroom was everything Richmond believed about itself amplified. Light everywhere, music from a full ensemble, women in winter silks and men in their best coats, and the air thick with expensive perfume, and the specific energy of 200 people performing their best versions of themselves for each other. Eleanor walked in on Alexander's arm, and felt the room register their presence the way it always did, now that subtle collective shift of attention that meant Blackwood is here. And she kept her chin level and her grip on his arm easy, and she thought about nothing except the next 10 seconds. 10 seconds at a time. She had survived harder rooms that way. They were 20 minutes into the evening, Alexander in conversation with two men Eleanor recognized as business associates. She in conversation with Charlotte Beale about something she was not fully attending to when she saw Jonathan across the room. He saw her at the same moment. She watched him assess the situation. She watched him look at Alexander, who was 15 feet away and currently absorbed in conversation. She watched him make a calculation. The calculation of a man who has a habit of managing situations to his advantage and has identified what he believes to be a brief window. He crossed toward her. Charlotte Beale's sentence stopped mid-word. Mrs. Blackwood, Jonathan said, arriving beside her with the ease of a man who had never learned to read a room that was reading him. You look well. Mr. Hale, she said. Charlotte Beale discovered something urgent across the room. Jonathan glanced at Alexander's back. I wanted to speak with you, privately ideally, but I suspect that is not possible, so I will be brief. You may be as brief as you like, Eleanor said. He lowered his voice. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the managed thing I offered at the Carver gathering. I have been thinking about what you said about what I did being unkind, and you were right. I was unkind. I had no excuse for it. The way I spoke to you that night at the society house was... He stopped. Something crossed his face that might have been genuine discomfort the first she had seen from him. It was wrong, and I am sorry. Eleanor looked at him. She had imagined at various points over the past 2.5 years receiving an apology from Jonathan Hale. She had imagined several versions, the managed one he had offered at the Carvers, the self-justifying one, where he apologized for her feelings while defending his actions, and occasionally in the very private and honest part of her imagination, the real one. The one that acknowledged what he had actually done. This was the real one. She recognized it. I accept your apology, she said. She said it simply, without triumph and without coldness. And I want you to know that I hold no continued anger toward you. What happened, it was painful. It set my life on a course I did not choose. But the course it set me on brought me to exactly where I am standing, and I find I cannot regret that. Jonathan looked at her for a moment. Something in his face settled some tension he had been carrying. You have become something remarkable, Eleanor. I was already something, she said. I simply have more room for it now. He nodded. He was about to step back when a voice came from just behind Eleanor's left shoulder. Hale. Not the controlled, almost courteous tone Alexander had used at the Carver gathering. Something different. Quieter. The voice of a man who has been listening, who has heard something he did not expect, and who is choosing his next words with unusual care. Jonathan straightened. Blackwood. Alexander stepped forward to Eleanor's side. He did not touch her. He simply stood close enough that his arm was against hers, the warmth of him, a physical fact beside her, and he looked at Jonathan with an expression Eleanor had not seen on him before. Not the flat, dismissive authority he had deployed at the Carvers. Something more complex, Something that was almost, she searched for the word, almost acknowledgement. "That was decently done," Alexander said to Jonathan, quietly enough that only the three of them could hear it. Jonathan blinked. Of all the things he might have expected, that was clearly not among them. The apology," Alexander said. "It was decently done. My wife deserved one, and you gave her a real one rather than a managed one. I noticed the difference." A pause. "So did she." The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Jonathan Hale looked at Alexander Blackwood, and then he looked at Eleanor, and then he did something Eleanor had never seen him do in 2 years of knowing him. He looked genuinely uncertain, genuinely unsure of his own footing. The careful, self-possessed social machine that Jonathan had always been was standing in front of these two people, and it did not know what face to wear. "Thank you," he said finally to both of them, though it wasn't entirely clear for what. He withdrew. Eleanor watched him cross back to Amelia and felt for the first time in 2.5 years something loosen in her chest that she had not known was still held tight. Not forgiveness exactly, she had told him the truth, that she held no anger, but something else. The final releasing of a weight she had become so accustomed to carrying that she had stopped noticing it was there. She exhaled. Alexander beside her said quietly, "All right." "Yes," she said. And then, "How long were you standing there?" "Long enough," he said. "You didn't step in." "You didn't need me to." She looked at him. "You waited." "I have been known to wait," he said, "when the person who is speaking is handling things better than I would." She looked at him for a long moment. The music behind them had shifted into something slower, one of the country dances that required partners, and the floor was filling with couples. Around them, the Whitfield ballroom continued its magnificent humming, self-important life. And Eleanor stood in the middle of all of it and looked at the man beside her and felt something she had been telling herself carefully and firmly for 3 months that she was not feeling. "Alexander," she said. "Yes. Would you—" She stopped, started again. "Would you like to dance?" He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I should warn you. I am not particularly skilled at it." "That is all right," she said. "I am." Something happened to his face that she had not seen before. Not the small adjustment she had catalogued over months of careful observation. Something larger. Something that moved through his whole expression and changed it. He offered his hand. She took it. They walked to the floor. He was not wrong about his dancing. He was slightly stiff, slightly deliberate, slightly more focused on the technical execution than on the flow of it. But he did not step on her feet, and he held her correctly, and he kept his attention on her face, rather than on what his feet were doing, which she thought said something true about him, that when he was with a person, he looked at the person, not at his own performance. "You are thinking something," he said after the first turn. "I am always thinking something," she said. "Something specific," he said. "You get a particular expression." "What expression?" "Like you are writing something down in your head," he said. "In the ledger you keep in there." She almost missed a step. Not because the dancing threw her, but because the accuracy of it landed somewhere unexpected. "You have been paying attention," she said. "I always pay attention to you," he said. Simply. As though it were an established fact, he saw no reason to make complicated. The music moved them through the turn, and Eleanor looked at Alexander Blackwood, at the serious, controlled face that she had been reading for 4 months, at the place behind his eyes, where things happened that he did not always have words for. And she thought about her mother saying that kind of afraid means it matters. She was afraid. It mattered. She thought about what she had told Jonathan the course it set me on brought me to exactly where I am standing. She was standing here, and she thought for the first time clearly, and without the careful bracketing she had applied to every other version of this thought, "I don't want to be anywhere else." The music carried them through another turn. Alexander's hand was steady at her back. His other hand held hers with a grip that was careful in the way he was careful with things he did not want to damage. She felt it. She knew what it meant. She had been learning his language for 4 months, and she knew as surely as she knew the household accounts what that careful grip communicated. "Alexander," she said. "Yes." "I am revising something," she said. He looked at her. "What are you revising?" "My assessment," she said. "Of this arrangement. Of what it is." He was very still, even in motion. "And what have you concluded?" "That it is more than an arrangement," she said. "And that I think you know that already. And that I think you have been waiting for me to know it too." The music reached the end of the figure. They stopped. Around them, the other couples applauded lightly. Neither of them moved for a moment, standing in the middle of the Whitfield ballroom, with the January night pressing against the windows, and 200 people moving around them and paying them exactly the amount of attention they always paid to Alexander Blackwood, which was considerable. "Yes," he said. "I have been waiting." "How long?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Since the evening in the study," he said. "When you said the word lonely, when you said that you thought it would feel lonely, to have people respond to what they expected instead of to you." A pause. "No one had ever put a word to it before. I did not know I was waiting for someone who would put words to it until you did." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the Richmond Society House 2.5 years ago, about the candles and the judgment and the sound of a soft laugh from her left shoulder. She thought about the cold thing that had settled into her spine that night and hardened there, the thing she had been carrying ever since. Not bitterness, not grief, but a particular guarded practicality, a deliberate closing off of the part of herself that had once been willing to hope for something warmer than survival. She thought about what it had cost her to open that back up, what it had taken. 4 months of Thursdays in the study, and a trip to her father's sickbed, and a man who knocked before entering and meant it when he said he would wait. "I should tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I wrote a letter to my mother 2 months ago," she said. "I did not send it. It said that I was in the process of revising my reservations about this arrangement." She looked at him. "I want you to know that the revision is complete." Alexander Blackwood stood in the middle of the Whitfield ballroom on a January night and looked at his wife, and the expression on his face was something Eleanor had not seen on him before and would spend the rest of her life being glad she had not missed something open. Something that had come through the careful self-containment he wore like armor, something that was simply and entirely real. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes," she said. Before he had finished asking, before he had found the words for whatever he was working toward. "Yes." He took her hand. Not the formal hold of the dance, her hand inside both of his, held with that same careful grip that she now understood completely. "I should warn you," he said quietly, "that I am not skilled at this either." She looked at him. "That is all right," she said. "I think we are both learning." Around them, the music began again. Neither of them moved to rejoin the floor. They stood together in the noise and the light and the moving world of the Richmond Grand Winter Ball and held on. And somewhere across the room, Jonathan Hale and his wife were dancing. And the January night was cold outside the windows, and Eleanor Whitmore Blackwood was 22 years old and standing exactly where she had not known she was going when she started. And she was not afraid. Or rather, she was exactly as afraid as her mother had said she was allowed to be. The kind of afraid that meant it mattered. The kind of afraid that meant she was finally completely and without reservation all the way in. The ride home from the Whitfield ball was quiet, not the quiet of two people who had nothing to say. The quiet of two people who had said something significant and were still inside it, still feeling the weight and the shape of it, not yet ready to move past the moment into whatever came after. Eleanor sat across from Alexander in the carriage and watched the darkness outside the window and thought about the word yes. The way she had said it before he had finished asking, the way it had come out of her, without the usual careful processing. Without the checking and rechecking she applied to every significant decision. Just yes. Clean and immediate and entirely true. She had not said yes like that since before the Richmond Society House. She had not said yes to anything without first calculating the cost and the risk and the likelihood of being wrong. She had been wrong before. She knew what being wrong cost. But sitting in that carriage with the January cold pressing against the windows and Alexander on the seat across from her not speaking, not performing comfort or romance, or any of the things a man in that situation might have been tempted to perform. Just present. Just there. Just steady. She found she could not make herself regret it. The yes was out in the world now. It had been said. And it was right. Alexander spoke first. "Are you tired?" "No," she said. "Good." He looked at her across the dark. "I want to talk, when we are home, if that is all right." "It is," she said. Mrs. Harding had left a lamp burning in the front hall, as she always did when they were out late. The house was quiet around them as they came in, the good quiet, the settled quiet of a household that had organized itself and gone to rest and trusted the people in charge of it to return when they returned. Eleanor had come to love that quiet in a way she had not anticipated. The feeling of a place that was working. A place that was in some specific and real sense hers. She followed Alexander to the study. He built up the fire himself, one of the small things she had noticed about him early on, that he did not wait for servants to do things. He could do himself, that there was no performance of importance in the way he moved through his own house. He built up the fire, and she sat in the chair across from his desk and watched him and waited. He sat down. He looked at her. And then he said something she had not expected. "I need to tell you about my first engagement," he said. "The full account of it, not what I told you before." She looked at him carefully. "All right. I told you she ended it because she understood what the life would require," he said. "That is true. But it is not complete." He was quiet for a moment, working toward something. "The fuller truth is that I gave her no reason to stay. I was present in the same way I am present in any negotiation, attentive to the logistics, responsive to practical needs, reliable in every material way, and completely absent in every way that mattered to her as a person. She did not leave because she was wrong for my life. She left because I had not let her into it." Eleanor said nothing. She waited. "I built this house," he said. "Everything you see here, the estate, the operations, the position, I built it. And I built it alone, because building things alone is what I understood how to do. And somewhere in the process I concluded that alone was the appropriate condition for a man like me. That expecting anything more was a failure of self-knowledge." He looked at her directly. "I was wrong." "Alexander, I am not finished," he said. Not harshly. "I want to say this completely because I have never said it to anyone, and if I stop, I am not certain I will find my way back to it." She nodded. "What I felt when you came to my study with the harvest ledger," he said, "was not gratitude, or not only gratitude. It was recognition. The specific feeling of being seen accurately by someone who has paid careful attention. I had not felt that before. I did not know what to do with it." He paused. "And then in the following weeks, every Thursday, I kept finding reasons to extend the evenings. You would make a comment, and I would ask a question because I wanted to hear more. That is not a thing I have done with people. I do not ask questions for the pleasure of the answer. I ask questions because I need information. With you, I was asking for the pleasure of it." The fire had caught and was burning steadily. The house around them was very quiet. "And then your father," he said. "When I came with you, I want to be honest about that too. I did not come because it was the correct spousal behavior. I came because the thought of you going alone, of you sitting in that house, managing your fear by yourself, the way you manage everything alone, precisely efficiently, without ever asking for support. The thought of that was something I was not willing to accept." Eleanor felt something in her chest that was almost pain. Not quite pain. Something adjacent to it, the specific feeling of a protective wall meeting pressure from the inside. From something trying to get out rather than something trying to get in. "I have been alone for a long time," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "So have I. I became very good at it." "So did I," he said. "It is a poor substitute." She looked at him. "What are you saying, Alexander?" He looked back, steady, clear. The way he always was, the way she had come to understand, was not coldness, but the opposite of coldness, a kind of intense, focused presence that he brought to things that mattered to him, and that she had come to understand she was among. "I am saying," he said, "that I would like to stop being alone, with you, in whatever way you are willing to allow." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. The fire, the quiet house, the man across from her who had taken longer than most to say the thing, but who said it when he got there without decoration and without conditions. "I stopped being alone some time ago," she said. "I just did not admit it to myself." "When?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "The evening you came out to the porch," she said. "When I was mending my father's shirt. When you said lonely. When you repeated the word back to me and said it was the more accurate one." She met his eyes. "I think that was when." He was quiet for a moment. "That was in October." "Yes," she said. "You waited 3 months," he said. "I was being careful," she said. Something moved in his face, the almost smile she had catalogued. Then passed it into something that was an actual smile, small and private, and entirely real, the first full smile she had ever seen from him. And she thought with a sudden certain clarity that she wanted to spend a very long time being the person who occasionally caused that expression. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, I am going to be imperfect at this," he said. "I want you to know that in advance. I will be too focused on problems and not focused enough on people. I will forget to say things that I feel because I have spent 34 years not saying them. I will make decisions that are correct and forget to ask what you think before I make them. I will work too much and explain myself too little and—" "Alexander," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "I know all of that. I have been living alongside it for 4 months. She looked at him steadily. "And I have been managing a difficult household and making hard decisions and carrying my family's fears and doing it all without complaint, because I decided long ago that I did not need anyone to help me carry things." She paused. "We are both going to need to learn." "Yes," he said. "I am willing to learn if you are." "I am," he said. "Absolutely." She nodded. And then she said because it was honest, and she had decided that honest was the only thing worth being with this man, "I am afraid." "I know," he said. "Not of you," she said. "Of this. Of wanting something and having it. Of allowing myself to believe it will last." He stood up. He crossed to her chair. He crouched down so that he was at her level, which she had not expected this large, formal, deliberate man folding himself down. So he was looking up at her rather than down. So the geography of it was not about his authority, but about her. And he looked at her with the most unguarded expression she had yet seen on his face. "I cannot promise you nothing will go wrong," he said. "I am not built for false promises, but I can tell you that whatever goes wrong, I will be here working on it. Not managing it from a distance, not sending a man of business to address it, here, with you." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her hand against his face. He went very still, as though the gesture had startled something deep in him, something that did not know how to receive it, that had not been touched like that in a long time, or perhaps ever, something that needed a second to orient itself. She felt the stillness, and she did not move. She let her hand rest there against his jaw, and she felt him breathe. "All right," she said softly. "Then we learn." What followed was not a transformation. Eleanor had no patience for transformations. They were, in her experience, a way of describing slow, incremental change with false drama. What followed was simply continuation, but continuation at a different temperature. Warmer, more honest, more willing to ask and be asked. He started knocking, and then waiting for her to say, "Come in," instead of simply entering. He started consulting her before making household decisions that he had previously managed through Emmett Davies, and Davies was gone by January's end. Quietly and efficiently dismissed the accounts restructured under a new man, whose references Alexander had checked with the thoroughness he applied to everything significant, and whose hire he had discussed with Eleanor before it was finalized. "You did not have to consult me on that," she said when he told her. "You identified the problem," he said. "You should have a say in the solution." She looked at him. "That is not the way most men think about it." "I am aware," he said. "I am attempting to be different from most men." "You are succeeding," she said. He looked at her in that way, the filing away look, the one that meant he had noted something and put it somewhere. "Good," he said. She started leaving the study door open in the evenings, when she worked a small thing, barely a thing, but deliberate. An opening. An invitation to an arrangement that needed no words. He would come past on his way between rooms and stop and look in, and sometimes come in and sit, and sometimes not. And both were acceptable because the door being open said, "I am here, and you may come if you want." He always wanted. She had known he would. She had opened the door because she knew. Cheta. February brought a letter from Alexander's brother in Philadelphia. His name was Charles Blackwood, and he was 3 years younger than Alexander, and built from his letters entirely differently. Where Alexander was contained, Charles apparently overflowed. Eleanor had heard about him in fragments from the Thursday evenings, the brother who had gone to Philadelphia to study law, and stayed because he loved the city and the life, and a woman named Rebecca, who was a Quaker and disapproved of the family's tobacco interests, which had caused a long and complicated negotiation that Eleanor gathered was still ongoing. Charles's letter arrived on a Thursday morning, and Alexander read it at breakfast, which was itself a change reading correspondence at breakfast. He had previously taken all his letters to the study, and Eleanor watched his face go through something. Not alarm, something more private than alarm. "What is it?" she said. He looked up. "Charles is coming to visit," he said. "He wants to meet you." "That is good news," Eleanor said. "He says—" Alexander looked back at the letter, then he set it down. "He says he has been waiting for me to write, and tell him what had changed, because he has been reading my letters since September, and something is clearly different in them, and since I apparently failed to communicate this directly, he has decided to come and see for himself." Eleanor looked at him. "Something is different in your letters." "According to Charles," he said. "What does he say is different?" Alexander looked at her. A beat of silence. "He says I sound like a man who has a reason to come home." The words landed in the room and stayed there. Eleanor looked at her tea. She looked at the window. She thought about Alexander crossing the room toward her at the Carver's drawing room 8 months ago with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who had made a decision and was enacting it. She thought about all the rooms since then, the study, the carriage, the porch, the Whitfield ballroom. She thought about his hand holding hers with that careful grip. "He is observant," she said when she trusted her voice. "Insufferably so," Alexander said. "It runs in the family." She looked up at that and saw the almost smile, and she returned it with her own, and something moved between them that was easy and warm and entirely without performance. Charles arrived on a Tuesday in mid-February, and he was nothing like his brother and completely like his brother in every way that mattered. He was lighter in coloring and manner, in the way he entered a room which was not Alexander's controlled, deliberate occupation of a space, but something more like an enthusiastic suggestion. He smiled immediately and broadly, and at everything. He took Eleanor's hand when they were introduced and said, "Finally, he has been terrible at describing you. You are much better than his description." "What was his description?" Eleanor asked. "Capable," Charles said. "Practical. Intelligent." He looked at Alexander with the expression of a man conducting a long-standing argument. "I told him those words describe a good horse." "They describe a good partner," Alexander said without heat. "A partner, yes," Charles said. "Which is why I told him he needed more words." He turned back to Eleanor. "Are you happy that is what I actually came to ask?" Eleanor blinked. Yes. Good." He released her hand and looked satisfied. "Because he is difficult. I want you to know that I know he is difficult. I have known him for 31 years, and he has always been difficult. If he is being difficult in ways that are—" Charles, Alexander said. I am establishing that she has an ally, Charles said to his brother. Then to Eleanor, you have an ally. Eleanor looked at Charles Blackwood, and she thought this is what Alexander would be if he had learned differently. And then she thought, no, this is what Alexander is underneath. Charles just has less to protect. Thank you, she said to Charles. I will remember that. See that you do, he said. Now, show me this house. Alexander's letters say you have reorganized the entire domestic operation and improved the accounts by 18% in 4 months, and I want to hear all of it. She looked at Alexander. I did mention the accounts, he said. You mentioned them to your brother, she said. He asked how things were going, Alexander said. The accounts were how things were going. Charles was already moving toward the interior of the house with the cheerful expectation of a man who has never been unwelcome anywhere. Eleanor looked at Alexander for a moment, at the very slight, very controlled exasperation on his face that she had learned to read as affection in disguise, and she thought a reason to come home. She thought yes. She went to show Charles the house. Charles stayed 4 days, and by the end of the first day, Eleanor understood that what he had really come for was not to meet her, but to see Alexander. To see what Alexander was like now in this changed version of himself that his letters had apparently communicated without Alexander intending them to. She watched Charles watch his brother the way a younger sibling watches an older one. They have been worried about for a long time and are now relieved about, and she felt something tender and unexpected move through her at the sight of it. On the third evening, Charles found her in the kitchen, discussing the next week's provisions with Josephine. When Josephine excused herself, Charles sat down across from Eleanor and folded his hands on the table and said, He told me about your father. He did, she said. He told me he went with you, Charles said. That you needed to go, and he did not want you to go alone. He looked at her steadily. I want you to understand what that means. Alexander has never, in 31 years, I have never seen him follow someone somewhere because they needed him to. He solves problems. He addresses situations. He sends resources and solutions. He does not go himself. He went himself. Eleanor looked at her hands on the table. He loves you, Charles said. Simply, the way people state things they are completely certain of. He has not said so, she said. Carefully. He won't, Charles said. Not yet. Possibly not for a long time. He does not have the words for it yet. He has never had to find them before, and he is not the kind of man who says things he is not certain he can sustain. He leaned forward slightly. But Eleanor, he went. That is Alexander Blackwood's version of saying it. She sat with that for a long moment. I know, she said finally. I know. I have been learning his language. Charles smiled. It was Alexander's smile, the real one, the small and private one, but wearing Charles's easier face, which meant it was larger and more visible, and she could see it completely. Good, he said. Then you know more than most. The twist that changed everything came not from outside, but from inside the estate itself, and Eleanor did not see it coming, despite all her careful attention. It came in the form of a document. She found it on a Wednesday morning in March when she was reorganizing the estate records in preparation for the spring accounts. She had developed a system for the Blackwood records over the winter, a careful cross-referencing that Alexander had observed once and then left entirely to her, because he trusted her system more than he trusted the previous arrangement, which had been, she had discovered, considerably less rigorous than it should have been for an operation of this size. She was working through the older records, the ledgers from the years before their marriage, when she found the folder. It was labeled with her family name, Whitmore. She opened it. Inside were documents she had never seen. Correspondence between Alexander and her father's solicitor going back 18 months before their marriage, before the arrangement had been proposed, before Alexander had crossed the room toward her at the Carver drawing room. A letter of inquiry, a response, a follow-up inquiry, a financial assessment, and then a document she read 3 times before the full contents of it resolved into meaning. Alexander had been investigating her family's financial situation for 8 months before he proposed the arrangement. More than that, he had identified the Whitmore debts, the specific creditors, the specific amounts, and had quietly arranged for the most pressing of them to be addressed before he had ever spoken to her father, before he had ever met Eleanor. He had removed the sharpest edges of the crisis while remaining entirely invisible to the family, so that when he did approach her father, the situation was distressed but not desperate, possible to recover from rather than impossible. He had not done it as leverage. There was no correspondence suggesting leverage, no documentation of a quid pro quo. He had simply done it, cleared the worst of the immediate danger, and then come to the carver's drawing room and crossed the floor and said, "I require a wife." Eleanor sat very still with the folder in her hands for a very long time. She thought about every version of the story she had been telling herself about their arrangement. The honest bargain, the practical exchange, the clear-eyed decision made by 2 people who had decided that honesty was more durable than romance. She had been proud of that version. She had held on to it as evidence that she was not naive this time, not the woman who had believed Jonathan Hale's consistent letters and interpreted the social understanding of others as a kind of certainty. She had been telling herself that she had walked into this with clear eyes. What she was holding in her hands suggested that she had walked into it knowing less than she thought she had known. She did not know what to do with that. She sat there for 20 minutes, working through it, turning it over, trying to locate the correct emotional response because there were several available and she was not sure which one was accurate. Then she got up and she went to find Alexander. He was in the study. He looked up when she came in. He saw the folder. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to the expression of a man who has been carrying a thing he knew would eventually need to be put down, and who is now looking at the moment of putting it down. "You found it," he said. "Yes," she said. She put the folder on his desk. She looked at him. "Explain this to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your family's situation was more precarious than you knew. There were creditors who were not patient. Situations that were going to resolve badly and soon, without intervention. I was in a position to intervene." "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because I had been watching you for longer than you knew. Not in a way that was, Eleanor, I am not explaining this well." "Try again," she said. He took a breath. "I saw you first at the Richmond Society House, the night Hale—" He stopped. "The night of the Society House. I was there. I did not know you. I saw what happened. I watched you stand there and absorb it, and refuse to break and walk to the far side of the room and sit down by the window." He looked at her. "And I thought that woman is remarkable. And I thought nothing more of it because it was not my business, and it was not the right time, and I had no framework for what to do with a thought like that." Eleanor stood very still. "2 years later," he said, "when I had decided that I needed, when the question of a wife had become something I could not continue deferring, I remembered you. I made inquiries. I found out what had happened in the intervening time. I found out the state of your family's finances. And I realized that the situation was going to collapse in a way that would remove the possibility of any reasonable future for you, and I could not." He stopped again. "You could not allow it," she said quietly. "No," he said, "I could not." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the folder on his desk. She looked at his hands, which were flat on the desk in front of him, the careful, still posture of a man who has laid something down and is not going to pick it back up. "You took a significant risk," she said. "The arrangement might not have worked. I might have refused you." "Yes," he said, "or I might have accepted and been entirely wrong for what you needed." "Yes," he said. "You did it anyway," she said. "I did it anyway," he said. She breathed. She thought about Charles saying he went himself. She thought about the word lonely, and a porch in October, and a hand against her face in the firelight. She thought about what it meant to spend 34 years building something alone, and to decide finally that there was one person you were willing to stop building alone for, and to act on that decision with the same deliberate, thorough, all-the-way-in commitment you brought to everything else you had ever built. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Because I was afraid you would see it as manipulation, as removing your choice in the matter by shaping the circumstances." He looked at her. "And I want you to know, Eleanor. I want you to know that it was never intended that way. You could have refused me. I would not have, the debts would have remained cleared regardless. I did not do it to create an obligation." "I know," she said. "You know. There is no documentation of an obligation," she said. "I read everything in that folder. There is no documentation of leverage or expectation. You simply did it, and then came and asked." She held his gaze. "That is who you are. You saw a problem, and you removed it, and then you tried to be honest about everything else." He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression, the one that moved through the armor and showed what was underneath. "I am sorry I did not tell you sooner," he said. "You are forgiven," she said, without hesitation, without performance. Just truth. He exhaled a long, slow release of something he had been holding for months. She watched it move through him and felt something in herself release at the same moment, something parallel. Something she had not known she was holding until it let go. She crossed to his desk. She put her hand on top of his, the same way she had put her hand against his face in February. The gesture that was hers, now that she had made hers deliberately, and kept, because it said what she sometimes did not have words for. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Alexander," she said. "Yes. I need you to know something," she said. "What you did, the lengths you went to before you ever introduced yourself. I understand what that is. I understand what it means from a man who plans everything and commits only when he is certain." She pressed his hand. "It means that you decided on me. Before you knew me, on the strength of one evening when I refused to break." He was very still. "That is the most remarkable thing anyone has ever done for me," she said quietly. "And I need you to know I understand it. And I am not afraid of it." He stood up. He was very close. He looked at her with the full force of all that focused, careful attention. All of it, nothing held back. Not a single managed expression. Just him. And he said, "Eleanor, I love you. I have loved you in the way that I love things slowly, and then completely, and without the ability to stop." She looked at him. She had waited 2.5 years for someone to say words that were real. She had not known until this moment that real could feel like this, like the ground being solid, like something you had been bracing against, simply becoming something that held you. "I love you too," she said. "I have been loving you since October, and refusing to call it that." He put his forehead against hers. They stood like that in the study, in the room where everything between them had begun, where she had brought him the harvest ledger and he had asked her to stay for dinner, and the whole long, slow fall of it had started, and outside the Virginia spring was beginning to soften the air, and the house around them was working, and alive and full of everything they had built together. "What do we do now?" he said, and there was something almost like wonder in his voice. Alexander Blackwood, the most competent man she had ever met, genuinely uncertain about what came next, and not afraid to say so. She lifted her head. She looked at him. "Now," she said, "we stop being careful." Stopping being careful was not, it turned out, a single decision. It was a practice. A daily, sometimes hourly practice of choosing not to flinch, not to pull back into the careful management of distance that both of them had spent years perfecting. Eleanor understood this within the first 2 weeks after the study, after the folder, after the words they had finally said out loud to each other. The words had been said, the ground had shifted, and every morning she woke up in the Blackwood house, and the ground was still shifted, which meant the work now was learning to walk on it. She was not always graceful about it. The first time she was not graceful about it was a Sunday in late March, when Alexander came home from a 3-day trip to the western counties without sending word ahead. He had done this before their conversation in the study regularly, because it had not occurred to him that his movements required advanced communication to anyone. And she was in the middle of managing a crisis with the north wing roof, which had finally reached the point of urgency she had been anticipating since November, and she had been managing it alone for 3 days. And when he walked through the door, she felt something rise in her chest that came out not as relief, but as sharp, controlled anger. "You did not send word," she said. He looked at her. He read her face with the attention he always gave her. "I didn't," he said. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have. I have been managing the roof situation for 3 days without knowing when you would return, and the contractor is coming tomorrow morning. And I have been making decisions I should have been able to consult you about, and—" She stopped, breathed. "I am not angry about the decisions. I can make the decisions. I am angry that I did not know if you were coming back tomorrow or next week." He set down the bag he was carrying. He looked at her steadily. "I did not think about how it would feel from your position," he said. "No," she said. "You didn't." "That was wrong of me," he said. "I am sorry." She looked at him. She had been prepared in the part of herself that was still defensive for a version of this conversation where he explained, or managed, or redirected. She was not prepared for the clean, immediate acknowledgement. No qualifying, no explaining the pressures of the trip, no mild suggestion that she might have sent word herself if she needed to know. Just, "I was wrong. I am sorry." The anger lost its sharp edge. Not because he had apologized, but because he had done it right the same way she had told Jonathan Hale to do it the night of the Whitfield ball. Without management, without decoration. "Thank you," she said. "I will send word in the future," he said. "Always." "Yes," she said. "You will." He almost smiled. Was that a demand or an instruction? "Both," she said. "Fair enough," he said, and then moving toward her. "Tell me about the roof." She told him about the roof. He listened with the full attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, asked 2 precise questions, suggested 1 modification to the plan she had already developed that was genuinely better than her version, and agreed with everything else. By the time they sat down to supper, the anger had become something else entirely. Something warmer. Something that knew itself to be the specific heat that comes from being in close proximity to a person you love, who is also occasionally deeply frustrating, and from knowing that the frustration is part of the closeness and not a threat to it. She had not known that before. She had not had a model for it. She was learning. The spring of 1817 moved through Virginia the way springs move through that part of the world, fast and then slow, and then overwhelmingly green, the heat building in layers from the ground up. Until by May, it was the full, deep warmth of a Virginia summer, settling in early. The estate came alive in ways Eleanor had not seen yet. Having arrived in the autumn, the kitchen garden behind the house exploding into productivity, the fields in the south quarter going in under the direction of the head groundsman, a quiet and enormously competent man named Samuel, who had been with the Blackwood land for 20 years, and who treated Eleanor's questions about the planting schedule with the same respectful seriousness he had apparently always reserved for Alexander. She loved the spring on the estate with an intensity that surprised her. She had grown up in Richmond in the managed, socialized version of Virginia, the city version, where nature was ornamental. This was not ornamental. This was working land, productive land that had a purpose and was fulfilling it. And the specific satisfaction of watching it fulfill its purpose was something she had not expected to feel so personally. "You are happy," Alexander said one evening in early May, coming to find her on the porch, where she had been sitting with a book she had not been reading, listening to the sounds of the evening. "I am," she said. He sat down beside her, not across from her, which she noticed. They had been doing this lately. The geometry of their proximity had shifted. "You look different when you are happy," he said, "than when you are satisfied." She looked at him. "You have cataloged my expressions." "Extensively," he said without apology. "And what is the difference between happy and satisfied?" He considered. Satisfied is when something has gone correctly. Happy is when you are not thinking about whether things are going correctly at all. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that is very accurate. I pay attention, he said. I know you do, she said. They sat together in the evening and listened to the land settle into the dark, and Eleanor thought about the word happy, turning it over, examining it the way she examined other things she wanted to understand fully. She had been satisfied for long stretches of her life. She had been competent and useful and correct. She had managed things well, and she had found a specific private pleasure in management. This was different. This was the thing underneath all the management, the thing the management had been protecting from exposure all those years, the raw, undefended capacity for simple contentment. For sitting next to a person in the evening and feeling that the evening was enough. She had not known she still had that capacity. She was glad with the fierceness that caught her that she had not lost it completely. The first real test of everything they had built came in June, and it came from a direction Eleanor had not anticipated. Amelia Worthington Hale arrived at the Blackwood estate on a Tuesday morning without announcement in a hired carriage with a bruise along her left jaw that she had done her best to conceal with powder and had not fully succeeded. Mrs. Harding brought Eleanor the news in the kitchen where Eleanor was going over the week's provisions with Josephine. Eleanor set down the ledger immediately. Amelia was standing in the front hall when Eleanor found her. She was composed in the specific way of a woman who has decided to be composed, because the alternative is not possible in a public space, a composure Eleanor recognized having worn it herself. The baby she had been carrying at the Whitfield ball was not with her. She was alone. "Mrs. Blackwood," Amelia said. Her voice was steady. "I apologize for coming without notice." "You don't need to apologize," Eleanor said. She looked at Amelia's jaw. She looked at Amelia's eyes. She made her assessment quickly and completely. "Come in, we will have tea." She did not ask about Jonathan immediately. She brought Amelia into the small sitting room, and she ordered tea, and she sat across from this woman who had once stood beside the man who had humiliated her in front of a room full of people, and she looked at her without history or judgment, and she waited. Amelia held the teacup with both hands. She said, "I did not know where else to go." "You came to the right place," Eleanor said. "You have every reason to turn me away," Amelia said. "What Jonathan did to you, I knew it was wrong. Even then, even when it was happening, I knew. And I stood beside him and said nothing." "You were 20 years old," Eleanor said, "and you were in love with him." Amelia looked at her. Something in her expression cracked just slightly at the edges. "I was," she said. "I was very much in love with him." "What happened?" Eleanor said, quietly. "Just asking," Amelia told her. "It came out in pieces not all at once, the early years of the marriage, when things had been manageable, when Jonathan's particular version of managing everything and everyone around him had felt like strength rather than control. The way it had shifted after the baby, a son born healthy, named Thomas, who was at her mother's house, while Amelia had come here. The way Jonathan's insistence on managing everything had become something else over the past year. The argument 3 days ago that had ended with the bruise on her jaw that she had dressed with powder and hoped was invisible. Eleanor listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not offer comfort that minimized or explanations that excused. She simply listened with the full, careful attention she gave to everything she took seriously. When Amelia finished, Eleanor said, "Is Thomas safe?" "Yes," Amelia said. "My mother, she knows. She has him." "Good," Eleanor said. "Then the first thing is handled." She looked at Amelia. "What do you need?" Amelia blinked. I don't know. I thought I came here because you seemed like someone who would know what to do." "I do know what to do," Eleanor said. "But I need to know what you want first, what you need from this moment forward." Amelia was quiet. She looked at her hands around the teacup. She said very quietly, "I need to not be afraid in my own home." "Then we will make sure that is not something you have to be," Eleanor said. She went to find Alexander. She told him everything efficiently and completely. She gave him the facts and the circumstances and what Amelia needed. She watched his face go through a very controlled version of several things. Anger. Yes, the specific cold fury of a man who has clear principles about how people should be treated and is looking at evidence of those principles being violated, and then the settling, the focusing, the same quality of attention he brought to every problem that required solving. "What does she want?" he said. "Safety first," Eleanor said. "After that, she hasn't gotten that far yet. She's still in the room where the ceiling fell in." He nodded. "She can stay here as long as she needs to." "I know," Eleanor said. "I already told her." He looked at her. "You told her before you asked me." "Yes," she said. "Was I wrong to?" He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "You were not wrong." A pause. "We will need to speak with her about the legal situation. There are options more than she may know about." "I know," Eleanor said. "But today is not for legal situations. Today is for letting her feel that the floor is still there." He nodded slowly. "Yes, you're right." He looked at her with that expression, the one she loved most, the one that was simply him, seeing her accurately and not trying to adjust what he saw. "You are very good at this." "At what?" "At knowing what people need before they know it themselves," he said, "and at giving it without making them feel managed." She thought about all the years she had spent making herself useful as a defense mechanism, all the careful, practical competence she had built because it was armor. She thought about what it felt like now, doing the same things from a different place, from inside a life that was solid, from inside a house that was hers, from inside a self that was not afraid. "I had good training," she said, "and good reason to stop using it as a wall." He put his hand on her face, his version of her gesture, something she had not realized he had adopted until the third or fourth time he did it, and he looked at her for a moment with everything visible. "Go back to her," he said. "I will handle the rest." She went. Amelia stayed for 10 days. In those 10 days, Alexander quietly engaged the services of a solicitor. He trusted a man in Richmond named Garrett, who had the combination of integrity and pragmatism that the situation required, and the picture of Amelia's legal options became considerably clearer and considerably more hopeful than Amelia had known was possible. Alexander did this without fanfare and without placing himself at the center of the story. He provided the resource and stepped back. Garrett would tell Eleanor later that Blackwood had been very specific, help her understand what is available to her, and let her decide. Do not steer, do not manage, inform, Eleanor. Hearing this had felt something in her chest that was simple and enormous and had no name. She could put to it, except, "This is the man I married." On the 8th day, Amelia found Eleanor in the kitchen garden and sat down beside her on the low stone bench that ran along the south wall. "Can I ask you something?" Amelia said. "Yes," Eleanor said. When Jonathan said what he said, at the society house." She looked at her hands. "How did you survive the next part? The part right after when you did not know what came next?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. "I got practical," she said. "I took the grief and I put it in a drawer and I picked up the household accounts and I made myself useful. And that worked for about 2 years, and it kept me from breaking, and it also kept me from being fully alive, from actually feeling anything I was not able to control." Amelia was quiet. "And then something happened that I did not plan for," Eleanor said. "Someone saw me clearly, and kept seeing me clearly until I could not pretend the seeing wasn't happening." She looked at Amelia. "What you need right now is the first part, the practical part, the getting through. You will have time for the rest later. Right now, just get through." Amelia nodded. Then she said, "He is not a bad man." Eleanor looked at her carefully. "I know what he is," Amelia said. "I know what he did. I am not excusing it. But I keep going back to the beginning, to who I thought he was." "I know," Eleanor said. "That is the hardest part. When someone shows you who they actually are, you spend a long time grieving who you thought they were. Those are two separate losses." Amelia looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I had to grieve both," Eleanor said. "The man I thought Jonathan was, and the future I had built around him." She paused. "It takes longer than you think it should. And then one day it's done, and you wonder what you were waiting for." Amelia left on the 10th day, to her mother's house, to her son, to the beginning of the legal process that would reshape her life into something she could live in. She embraced Eleanor at the door, not the careful social embrace of women in their position, but a real one, the kind that said something words would make smaller. "Thank you," she said. "Take care of yourself," Eleanor said. "And Thomas." "I will." Amelia stepped back. She looked at Eleanor, at all of her, the way a person looks when they are trying to remember accurately. "You are nothing like what I expected when I came here." "What did you expect?" Amelia almost smiled. "Someone who would have every right to turn me away." "I had every right," Eleanor said. "I chose differently." The summer deepened around them, and the estate worked, and the house was full, and Alexander came home every time he went away, which he still did, but always with word sent ahead, always with a clear return date, always with the small but significant adjustment of a man who has learned that what he builds in his absence has value, and that the person tending it has a right to know when he is coming back. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden on a Thursday evening in July when he found her. She had her hands in the dirt she had taken to gardening with a seriousness that had surprised her and delighted Josephine, who had opinions about tomatoes, and she looked up when she heard his step. "You're home early," she said. "The meeting concluded faster than expected," he said. He crouched down beside her without concern for his coat. "Josephine says the tomatoes are doing well." "Josephine is proud of the tomatoes," Eleanor said. "They are her tomatoes. I am just the labor." Josephine said, and I am quoting, that Mrs. Blackwood has better hands for it than anyone she's worked with in 15 years, and she does not give that observation lightly. Eleanor looked at her dirty hands. She thought about the household ledger, and the harvest records, and the north wing roof, and the 10 days of Amelia, and all the long months of learning this house, and this land, and this man. She thought about all the things she had turned out to be capable of, that she had not known she was capable of, until she had been given the room to find out. "Alexander?" she said. "Yes. I am going to have a child." The words came out simply. She had known for 3 weeks, and had been carrying it in the careful internal way she carried things she needed time with before she could share them, not because she was afraid of his response, but because she wanted to know her own response first completely before she handed it to anyone else. She knew her response now. She had known it for 2 weeks. She was looking at him when she said it, and she watched everything happen on his face, the split second of pure, unguarded shock, and then beneath it, like light coming through a crack. Something she had never seen on him before. Something open and bright, and entirely without management or control. Something that was simply joy arriving before he could frame it or contain it. Just joy, naked and complete. He sat down on the ground beside her, without calculation or self-consciousness, in his good coat in the dirt of the kitchen garden. He sat down and he took both her hands in both of his dirt and all, and he held them, and he looked at her, and he did not say anything for a long moment. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I am very well," she said. "Are you—" He stopped. "How do you feel about it?" "How do I feel about it?" she repeated. She looked at their joined hands. She thought about everything she had decided 2.5 years ago, about not imagining a future that depended on another person's choices. She thought about what it had felt like to dismantle those imaginings. She thought about what it felt like now to have them back. Not the old ones, not the naive ones, not the ones built on Jonathan Hale's consistent letters and a society's approval. New ones, built on solid ground. Built on a man who sat in the dirt in his good coat because the moment required it and the coat was irrelevant. "I feel," she said slowly, "like someone who has been given something they had stopped believing they were allowed to want." He squeezed her hands. His voice when he spoke was lower than usual, the register he used when something had gotten all the way through. "Eleanor." "I know," she said. "I love you," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I love you." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his mouth, both of them together, dirt and all, and she felt him breathe against her knuckles, and she closed her eyes and sat in the kitchen garden in the Virginia July heat, and let herself be all the way inside the moment, without managing it or measuring it, or holding any part of herself back from it, all the way in it. The child was born in February of 1818 in the room Eleanor had slept in alone for the first month of their marriage, which was now their room. Had been their room since the spring, another shift that had happened gradually and then completely. A daughter, dark-haired, which was Alexander, and stubborn about sleeping, which was Eleanor, and loud in her opinions from the first hours, which Mrs. Harding said was both of them, and said it with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has watched a household become a family and takes justified credit for the surviving of the transition. They named her Margaret for Eleanor's mother, who arrived 3 days after the birth and sat with the baby for an entire afternoon without putting her down, and cried twice, which Margaret Whitmore would have denied under any form of questioning. Alexander held his daughter for the first time, and Eleanor watched his face and thought, there it is again. The thing that gets through the armor. The joy that arrives before he can frame it. She made a private decision, then watching him hold Margaret. She decided she was going to spend the rest of her life making sure that joy had somewhere to come to. That it was not a thing he had to protect or contain or keep separate from the machinery of everything he had built. That it could simply exist in this house, in this life, as a natural and permanent part of it. That was what she could give him that no one had given him before. Not management, not competence, not even love exactly, though it was love that made it possible. She could give him a place where he did not have to be only the man who built things, where he could also be the man who sat in the dirt in his good coat, where the armor could come off because the thing inside it was safe. She thought, this is what it was all for. Not the Richmond Society house, not the humiliation or the 2 years of careful survival or the practical arrangement, or even the folder in the estate records with the Whitmore name on it. Not any single piece of it, all of it together. The whole long path of it, every difficult and painful and unexpected turn leading here to this room, to this man, to this daughter, to this life that was hers, in every room and every account and every decision and every Thursday evening and every moment she had chosen to stop being careful and stay. The years that followed were not perfect. Eleanor had no patience for perfect. It was, in her experience, a word people used to describe things they hadn't examined closely enough. What the years that followed was real. Alexander remained too focused and too controlled, and occasionally too certain that the efficient solution was the right one. Eleanor remained too self-sufficient and too slow to ask for help, and too prone to carrying things alone until they became heavy enough to require comment. They argued, not often, but genuinely, with the specific, honest friction of two people who were both accustomed to being right and had to work every time to remember that being right together was different from being right alone. They learned. They had a second child 2 years after Margaret, a son named Thomas, for Eleanor's father, who was well by then, who had improved steadily under Dr. Harlow's care, and who spent 3 weeks at the estate every summer and played chess with Alexander with the deep competitive pleasure of two men who have reached a genuine respect for each other's intelligence. Clara, Eleanor's sister, had her season. She married well and happily a kind, steady man from a good Fredericksburg family who was nothing like Jonathan Hale, and everything like what Clara needed, and Eleanor attended the wedding, and sat beside Alexander, and held his hand through the ceremony, and felt nothing but uncomplicated joy for her sister's ordinary solid happiness. Charles visited twice a year. He and Alexander argued about everything and agreed about the things that mattered, and Charles always found Eleanor in whatever room she was working in on his first morning back, and said, "Is he still impossible?" And Eleanor always said yes, and very much worth it. And Charles always grinned like a man who has been hoping for exactly that answer. Mrs. Harding stayed. She and Eleanor reached in the second year the thing that had been waiting to happen since their first conversation about the north wing roof. A genuine mutual regard, practical and unsentimental. The specific warmth of two women who understand each other's competence and have stopped needing to prove anything to each other. It was not friendship exactly. It was better than friendship. It was the thing you get when you have been through something difficult alongside someone and come out the other side trusting them. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, a September evening that had come around again to the heavy, warm darkness of the Virginia summer's end, Alexander found Eleanor on the same back porch where they had first talked. Same chairs, different everything else. He sat beside her. He had a glass of water and she had a book she was not reading, and the house behind them was alive with the sound of Margaret running from one room to another, and Thomas's voice raised in protest at something, and Mrs. Harding somewhere in the back, managing both situations with calm authority. He said, "Do you remember what you said to me the first evening we talked here?" "I said many things," she said. He said that you thought it would feel lonely, to have people respond to what they expected, rather than to you." She looked at him. "You remember that?" "I remember everything you have said to me," he said. "I told you that. I pay attention." She turned toward him in her chair. 5 years of his face. 5 years of learning to read it, of watching it change, and stay the same, and let things through and hold things back. 5 years of being the person he turned it toward, with nothing managed. She knew this face, the way she knew the household accounts. Better. "Are you lonely?" she said. "No," he said. He said it simply and immediately, and with the complete certainty of a man who has looked at the question from every angle and arrived at an answer he is not going to revise. "No, I am not lonely." "Good," she said. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, what I built before." He paused, found the words. "What I built before you, it was considerable. I am not without pride in it, but I built it because I did not know what else to do with myself. I did not know what I was building toward." He looked at her. "Now I know." She held his gaze. "What are you building toward?" He looked at her steadily, the way he always had, the way she had learned to stand inside without flinching. Because it was not judgment. It was never judgment. It was simply the full weight of his attention, and it had always meant that she mattered. "This," he said, "exactly this." Eleanor Blackwood looked at the man she had married for practical reasons with clear eyes, and no illusions in a church. On a Tuesday in September. 5 years ago, the man who had sat in the dirt in his good coat, who had gone himself when she needed him to go, who had said lonely, was the more accurate word, who had held her daughter for the first time with joy, arriving before he could contain it, and she felt something that had no useful name and required none. She reached over and took his hand. Outside, the Virginia night was warm and full of sound. Inside, Margaret was still running, and Thomas had apparently won whatever argument he had been having, and the house was alive and loud, and entirely, completely theirs. She had walked into the Richmond Society House at 20 years old with her mother's ivory lace pressed against her collarbone, and her world had ended in public view. She had stood at the edge of the room and felt something cold settle into her spine and harden there. She had survived it. She had survived the 2 years after it. She had walked into an arrangement with clear eyes and discovered slowly and then completely that the clear eyes had shown her something truer than anything the romantic version of herself had ever been able to see. She had not been saved by wealth. She had not been saved by status. She had not been rescued by a man who swept in and rearranged her circumstances. She had done the work herself every day of it, every account and every decision, and every moment of choosing to open the door instead of keeping it closed. What Alexander had given her was not rescue. It was room. Room to be exactly who she was, all the way without apology and without management, in every room of a house that was hers, and a life that was hers, and a love that was built on respect first, and had discovered everything else inside the respect. She had been told at 20 by a man who smiled without kindness that fine was not sufficient. She knew now, had known for years, would know for the rest of her life, that she had never been fine. She had always been remarkable. She had simply needed someone who could see it clearly enough to wait.